Cole Mercer snatched the travel bag right out of Marin's hand before she even crossed the threshold. He held it up in the freezing air like it was evidence of something shameful, turning to the men behind him with a grin that had no warmth in it at all. "Boys," he said, loud enough for everyone on that porch to hear, "they sent us a widow with a baby." He dropped the bag in the snow. Not set it down. Dropped it. "Somebody tell me, what in the hell is a woman like this going to do when 16 hungry cowboys ride in half dead from the trail and want a real meal?" The laughter hit Marin like a fist. Her daughter pressed into her side and said nothing. But if this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you never miss what comes next. Drop a comment below and tell me the city and country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. And if you're staying until the end, tap that like button. You won't regret it. The stagecoach had no padding left on its seats. Marin Whitmore had been sitting on bare wood for 11 hours, her daughter Lily curled against her side with a wool blanket that had seen too many winters. Outside, Wyoming was doing what Wyoming does in February, trying to kill everything that wasn't born to it. Wind like a blade. Sky the color of a pewter pot that had never been polished. Snow so fine and hard it ticked against the coach windows like thrown gravel. Lily slept. Marin did not. She sat with her hands folded in her lap and her spine straight and her eyes open, watching the white nothing blur past outside and running numbers in her head. Flour, salt pork, dried beans. How many men? How many meals a day? How many days until the supply wagon could come up from Cheyenne? She had memorized the letter from the Black Hollow Ranch Employment Agency 3 times over. Cook needed, hardworking, experienced, wages paid monthly, quarters provided. It had not mentioned winter would look like this. It had also not mentioned, and this was the part she returned to most in the long dark hours of the ride, whether they knew she was bringing Lily. She told herself it would be fine. She told herself a working ranch needed a real cook more than it needed politics about who was allowed to show up. She told herself she had handled harder rooms than a bunkhouse full of cowboys. She told herself these things the way you tell yourself things when you know the truth might be worse. The coach lurched, slowed, and the driver's voice came down muffled through the roof. "Black Hollow. End of the line, ma'am." Marin woke Lily with a hand on her shoulder. "Up, sweetheart. We're here." Lily lifted her head, blinked, looked out the window. "It's all white," she said. "Yes. Where's the ranch?" "Just ahead." "Is it nice?" Marin picked up the travel bag. "It will be." The house was bigger than she expected and darker than it had any right to be in the middle of an afternoon. 2 stories, timber and stone, with a porch that ran the width of the front and a roof that sagged slightly on the left side in a way that told her someone had been meaning to fix it for at least 2 years. Smoke came from one chimney, just one. The other was cold. There were men on the porch, 4 of them, leaning against the rail the way men lean when they've decided something before you've opened your mouth. They had that settled quality of people who already know what they think of you. Marin saw it in their posture before she saw their faces. She came up the path with her bag in one hand and Lily's hand in the other, and she did not look at the ground. The one who moved first was Cole Mercer, though she didn't know his name yet. Tall, with a jaw like a fence post, and eyes that were doing the particular math that some men do when they see a woman arrive somewhere they don't think she belongs. He pushed off the rail and came down the 2 porch steps and stopped right in her path. "Help you?" he said. The tone said the opposite. "Marin Whitmore," she said. "I was hired by the Black Hollow Ranch Employment Agency. I'm the new cook." The pause that followed was exactly 1 beat too long. Then Cole Mercer looked over his shoulder at the men on the porch, a look that meant something between them. Then he looked back at her, then at Lily. "The cook," he said. "That's right. You're the cook they sent. Mr. Mercer." She didn't know it was Mercer. She just needed a name to aim at, and she took a shot. She was right, from the way his expression shifted. "I don't know what the agency told you to expect, but I'm here, I'm experienced, and I'm cold. If someone would like to show me the kitchen, I'd like to get started." That was when he reached out and took the bag from her hand. Not gently, not helpfully. He pulled it out of her grip the way you take something from someone when you want to show them they have no power here, and he held it up in the air, high enough that she would have had to reach for it, and he said it loud. "Boys, they sent us a widow with a baby." He dropped the bag. It hit the snow with a soft thud and tipped sideways, the clasp opening just enough that the corner of Lily's extra dress peeked out into the cold. The laughter was not loud. It was worse than that. It was comfortable, like men laughing at something they've seen before and expect to see again. Lily did not cry. That was the thing Maren would remember later. Lily was 6 years old, and she had her mother's eyes, and she looked at those men on that porch without flinching, and she did not make a sound. Maren picked up the bag. She latched the clasp. She stood up and looked at Cole Mercer from a distance of about 4 feet, and she said very quietly, "Thank you for your welcome." Then she walked up the porch steps. The man who opened the front door had clearly not been expecting anyone. He was tall, in a way that said he used to be taller, before something had bent him slightly toward the ground. Dark hair shot through with gray at the temples. A face that looked like it had made peace with being disappointed. He was holding a piece of tack in one hand and a cloth in the other, and he had the look of a man who had been doing something simple, specifically to avoid doing something complicated. He looked at Maren. He looked at Lily. He looked at the bag in Maren's hand. He looked at Cole Mercer behind her, who said nothing. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. His voice was flat. Not rude, just flat. The way ground is flat when there's nothing growing on it. "Mr. Cross," she said. Gideon Cross, owner of the Black Hollow Ranch. She'd found his name in the paperwork the agency had given her. He was 38 years old, widowed for 3 years, ran 800 head of cattle with a crew that worked harder than most and complained less than some. The agency didn't mention... He stopped, started again. "I requested a cook, not..." "Me and my daughter," Maren said. "Yes, I should have written to clarify that. I apologize for the surprise. I can tell you that my daughter is not a burden. She's been raised in working environments and she understands when to stay out of the way. She will not interfere with the kitchen or the men's quarters, and she will not be your problem." She paused. "I, however, will be. I need to see the kitchen before I can tell you whether I can have supper ready by 6. Gideon Cross looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Kitchen's through the back," he said. And then, she had walked into bad kitchens before. She had walked into a railroad camp kitchen with a flour barrel that had a family of mice living in it and a stovepipe that was actively on fire. She had cooked in a boarding house where the water came in through a leak in the ceiling into a bucket someone had left there long enough to grow something she preferred not to identify. The Black Hollow kitchen was not the worst she had seen, but it was close. The stove was a good size, but one of the burner plates was cracked and someone had tried to repair it with a packing material that had since burned partway off. The work table had been used so hard that the center had a bow in it, not dangerous, but limiting. The pantry door was warped and would not close fully, which meant everything inside had been exposed to the temperature fluctuations of the room for God knew how long. A sack of flour had been opened and not properly resealed. She could see from the doorway that the top inch was discolored. She stood in the middle of the room for about 30 seconds, turning slowly, cataloging. Then she said to no one in particular, "Who's been cooking?" A voice from the doorway, one of the younger ranch hands who had followed her in, apparently out of curiosity. "Big Ed," he said. "He left in November." "Who's been cooking since November?" A pause. "Whoever." "Whoever," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am." "And nobody's been hurt?" The young man shifted his weight. His name, she'd learned later, was Danny Pruitt, and he was 19 and had been on the ranch 8 months and was the only person on the property who had not yet decided whether to be unkind to her. "Not from the food," he said carefully. "Not exactly." Maren took off her coat. She hung it on the hook beside the pantry door because there was no other place, and she rolled up her sleeves and she began going through the pantry shelf by shelf. She found beans, good, salt pork, usable but not for long, coffee that had been ground weeks ago and would be weak, a crock of lard with a rind on it, onions that had gone to sprout, dried apples that were fine, cornmeal that was fine, a partial barrel of molasses, sugar, very low, no fresh eggs, which meant the chickens weren't being properly managed, no butter, which told her the milk cow either wasn't being milked or wasn't producing, and she'd bet on the former. She came out of the pantry and found Lily sitting on the bench beside the work table, her hands in her lap, watching her mother the way she always did in new kitchens, with that particular stillness that was not shyness, but calculation. Lily was working out the room the same way Marin was, same eyes, same habit. "What do you see?" Marin asked her. Lily considered. "The pot hanger's bent," she said, "and somebody didn't clean the stove grates, and the window's got a crack in it." "Good," Marin said. "Don't touch the stove, the rest of it is fine to look at." She went back to taking inventory. Supper that night was not her best work. She had 6 hours and a broken burner plate in a pantry that had been neglected for 3 months, and she made bean soup with salt pork and onions, the ones that hadn't fully gone to sprout, and skillet cornbread, and she made coffee properly, which meant grinding beans she found in a sealed tin at the back of the shelf that someone had apparently been saving. It was simple food, it was hot, and it was seasoned, and it was enough. She watched from the kitchen doorway as the men came in from the cold, 12 of them, taking their places at the long table in the cookhouse with the automatic efficiency of people who have done this the same way for a long time. Coats on hooks. Hands washed, some of them. Hats off, most of them. Cole Mercer sat at the far end. She watched him pick up his spoon and look at the soup and pick it up again and eat it. He did not say anything. He did not change his expression. But she noticed, because she always noticed, that his bowl was empty before most of the other men were halfway through theirs. Danny Pruitt, sitting near the middle, looked up when she came out with the cornbread and said, "This is the best coffee I've had in 2 months." "Thank you." Seriously, whatever Big Ed was doing with it, it tasted like... He stopped himself. It wasn't this. Big Ed was probably not grinding it fresh. "Can we have it like this every morning?" "Yes." He went back to his supper, looking personally relieved, the way a 19-year-old looks when something simple has been fixed that he didn't know how to fix himself. Marin went back to the kitchen. She washed the cooking pots herself because there was no one to help her and because she needed to know what she was working with, and she made a list of everything that needed to be repaired or replaced and another list of what supplies needed to come in from Cheyenne, and she pinned both lists to the pantry shelf where they would not get lost. Then she stood in the middle of the kitchen in the quiet after supper, which was the time she always used for this, for standing still and feeling the room, learning what it needed. And she let herself notice that her shoulders were shaking, not from cold. She made herself stop after about 30 seconds. She was good at that. 30 seconds was enough. She found Lily asleep in the small room off the kitchen that someone had pointed her toward. A storage room, really, with a cot that had been left there God knows how long, but the mattress was dry and the blankets were wool, and it was warm enough. Lily had curled herself up with her coat on top of her and her boots still on. Marin unlaced the boots and set them by the wall. She pulled the coat up around her daughter's shoulders instead of under her because it would be warmer that way. She stood there for a moment in the dark. "We're here," she thought. "That's the first thing. We're here, and we're warm, and there's food, and we're here." She did not let herself think further than that yet. Gideon Cross found her the next morning before sunrise, which was when she was already in the kitchen working, which she suspected was earlier than he had expected. He stood in the doorway and watched her for a moment before he spoke. She was repairing the stovepipe seal with a proper packing material she'd found in the supply closet behind the feed room. She'd gone looking at 5 a.m. while the ranch was still sleeping. "Mrs. Whitmore?" he said. "Mr. Cross?" She did not stop what she was doing. "What are you doing to my stove?" "Fixing it." The seal was burned through on the left side. "You were losing heat, which means you were burning more wood to maintain temperature, which means you were spending more on firewood than you needed to. This will take about 20 minutes to set properly, and then it'll hold through the winter." He was quiet for a moment. "I was going to have someone look at that," he said. "Of course," she said, in a tone that was polite enough that he couldn't object to it. Another silence. She could feel him deciding something in the doorway. "I need to say something to you," he said finally. She set down the tool she was working with and turned around, because this felt like a conversation that deserved her full attention. She leaned back against the work table and looked at him directly. Gideon Cross had the face of a man who had rehearsed this and didn't like any version of it. "When the agency sent the letter confirming your hire," he said, "they did not mention you had a child." "No," Marin said. "I wouldn't have agreed to it if I'd known." "I know. This is a working cattle ranch. It's not—" He seemed to be searching for the right word and not finding it. "It's not a safe place for a little girl." "She's been in less safe places," Marin said. "And she's old enough to understand rules and to follow them. She won't be in the men's areas. She won't be in the barn unless someone takes her. She won't be underfoot." She paused. "I will tell you one more thing, and then I'll leave it alone. My daughter has never once in her 6 years been a burden to anyone who employed me. Not one complaint. What I'm asking you for is 2 weeks. Give me 2 weeks to prove I can do this job the way it needs to be done. And if you're not satisfied, Lily and I will leave without argument." Gideon Cross looked at her. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks. He looked past her at the stove, at the seal she'd been repairing, at the list she'd pinned to the pantry door. "Is that a supply list?" he said. 2 lists, repairs and supplies. The supplies are urgent, some of them within the next 10 days or will run short. I've prioritized them by need." He walked over and looked at the list. He stood there for a long moment, reading. "The flour barrel," he said. "The top inch is ruined. I've set it aside, but the rest is usable. The chickens, 12 eggs a day, minimum, if someone's collecting properly. I'll manage it myself if that's easier." He took the list off the shelf. He looked at it the way a man looks at something when he is recalculating. "I'll send Danny into town for what's on here," he said. "The repairs. I'll see what I can do." "Thank you." He turned to leave, stopped, did not turn back around. "The soup last night," he said to the doorframe. "It was the first decent meal we've had since November." Then he left. Marin turned back to the stove and finished the seal. Her hands were almost steady. Cole Mercer did not apologize. That much was clear by the end of the first week. He did not apologize, and he did not stop watching her the way a man watches something he expects to fail, with that particular quality of attention that is more like waiting than looking. He watched her carry wood. He watched her manage the fire. He watched Lily move through the kitchen, quiet and careful, the way Marin had raised her to be. He watched all of it, and he said nothing, which was almost more exhausting than if he'd said something. The second morning, he came into the kitchen before the other men were up and stood at the work table while she was making biscuits. She felt him before she saw him. That was a talent she'd developed over years, feeling the quality of a room change when someone with hostility in them entered it. She kept working. "You fixed that stove?" he said. "Yes." "Who showed you how?" "I worked it out." Silence. "You got experience with ranch work?" "I've cooked for cattle outfits before. Not in Wyoming, Montana mostly, and one winter in Kansas." "How many men?" "Largest crew I cooked for was 22. 3 meals a day, full outfit, cattle drive. 60 days. Another silence. She could feel him deciding whether to believe her. "Big Ed," he said finally, "could burn water." "I noticed the stove wasn't being used right," she said carefully. "So did everybody." He picked up a biscuit she'd already set out to rise and looked at it, turning it in his hand. "These gonna be any good?" She did not look up. "Put it down." He put it down. "They'll be ready in 40 minutes, she said. He left. He was back in 38 minutes with 5 other men behind him, all of them pretending they just happened to be coming in for coffee at that particular moment. And she pulled the biscuits from the oven and set them on the table and said nothing. And she watched Cole Mercer take one and eat it in 2 bites, and then take a second one without looking at her. It was not an apology, but it was something. Bocab. The day that changed things between her and Gideon Cross was not a dramatic day. It was a Wednesday. She knew it was Wednesday because she'd been marking the days on a paper she'd tacked inside the pantry door, not because she was counting down, but because in isolated places you lose track of time if you're not careful, and losing track of time is the first step toward losing track of everything else. Gideon came in from the north pasture in the middle of the afternoon, earlier than usual, and she could tell from the way he moved that something had happened. Not a disaster, and his face wasn't that, but something. He sat down at the work table instead of going to his office, which was unusual, and he sat there for a moment just not doing anything, which was more unusual. She poured him coffee without asking. He took it without acknowledging it, which told her he was somewhere else in his head. She went back to what she was doing, which was working out the supply numbers for the next 3 weeks based on what Danny had brought back from town and what she estimated the usage rate was going to be once the weather fully turned. After a few minutes, Gideon said, "Northeast pastures got a fence line coming down." "Okay," she said. "Cole says we can get to it next week, but if we get another storm before then—" He stopped. "The cattle drift?" she said. He looked at her, slightly surprised. "Yeah. And if they drift too far in the wrong direction before you can get them back, we lose some," he said. "Maybe more than some." She nodded. She kept working. Then she said, "Mr. Cross, can I ask you something that's outside my job?" "Go ahead." "Your winter supply order. When did you put it in?" He looked at her, not defensively, more like he was assessing why she was asking. "October," he said. "Same as every year." "Based on how many men?" 12. "You've got 14 on current crew." Silence. "Danny and Pete came on in November," he said. "After your order went in," she said. Longer silence. "The order won't cover the full winter," she said. "Not at 14 men. I've been running the numbers since I got here. I didn't want to say anything until I was sure." She turned around and picked up the paper she'd been working on and handed it to him. "I can stretch it. I know how to stretch it. There are ways to manage rations without anybody knowing they're being managed, and I can do that. But I wanted you to know so you could make the decision about whether to put in a supplemental order now while the road's still passable, or wait, and let me handle it with what we have." Gideon looked at the paper. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "How long have you known about this?" "I've been sure for about 4 days," she said. "I wanted to be sure before I told you." He set the paper on the table. He looked at it. He looked at the wall. He did the thing she'd noticed he did when he was thinking hard, which was press his thumbnail against the edge of the table and not seem to notice he was doing it. "If we put in a supplemental order," he said, "I need it to go in within the week." "The road will be clear for at least another 8 days," she said. "I've been watching the weather." She paused. "I don't mean to overstep—" "No," he said. He looked at her then. Something had shifted in his face. Not warmth, exactly. More like recalibration. Like someone who had been looking at a picture one way and just noticed it was also possible to look at it another way entirely. "No, you're not overstepping." He picked up the supply paper and took it with him. He went to his office, and she heard the sound of him writing for a long time. The supplemental order went out the next morning. The supplemental order saved them the first time. The second time, nothing could have saved them except Marin herself. And even she would tell you later that it came closer than anyone knew. But that was still weeks away. In the days that followed Gideon's trip to the post office in Clearwater, the ranch settled into the kind of routine that working places develop when someone finally puts the right person in the right position. Not peaceful. A cattle ranch in a Wyoming winter is never peaceful, but functional. The difference between a clock that's running and a clock that keeps stopping every few hours to remind you it's broken. Marin ran the kitchen the way she ran everything, with the quiet relentlessness of someone who understood that the margin between a crew that could work and a crew that couldn't was almost always the meal they woke up to. She was up before anyone else. She had coffee ready before the first boots hit the bunkhouse floor. She knew by the end of the second week that Danny Pruitt took his with extra sugar, that the hand named Cal Briggs had a back tooth that gave him trouble with hard biscuit crusts, that the oldest man on the crew, a quiet Texan named Walt Haber, ate almost nothing at breakfast but needed more at noon than men half his age. She filed all of it away without making a production of it. She just changed what she made accordingly. Softer biscuits. Bigger noon portions for Walt. Extra coffee in the pot at the hour she'd noticed most of the men came in from the first morning shift. None of them noticed it happening. That was the point. Danny noticed eventually. Danny was perceptive in the specific way that young people are perceptive when they haven't yet learned to pretend they aren't paying attention. "You make different things for different people," he said one morning, watching her ladle soup into bowls. He said it as a statement, not an accusation, just an observation that surprised him. I make what people can eat, Marin said. Walt's bowl is bigger. Walt works the north fence. It's the hardest line to run in this cold. Danny considered this. Cole's coffee is different too. It's stronger. Cole starts earlier than the others. He comes in mean every morning. He comes in tired every morning, Marin said. Same thing, different cause. Danny chewed on that for a while. Then, did you always do this? Know what people needed without asking? Marin handed him his bowl. When you cook for large groups, you learn fast that the food isn't really about the food. He looked at her. What's it about? Whether people feel like someone thought about them, she said. Even once. Even just a little. He went quiet, ate his soup. Then he said, in a voice that was trying to sound casual, My mother used to make soup like this, the way you do the broth. Marin did not say anything to that. She just nodded and went back to the stove, because sometimes the kindest thing you can do for a 19-year-old boy a long way from home is to let him have his thought without turning it into a moment. The soup went on the fire for another 3 hours. That afternoon, Danny fixed the warped pantry door without being asked. He just showed up with tools and fixed it, and when Marin said thank you, he shrugged and said he'd been meaning to do it anyway. She let him have that too. Cole Mercer noticed the pantry door the next morning. He stood in the doorway of the kitchen and looked at it, and then he looked at Danny, and then he looked at Marin, and he didn't say anything. He picked up his coffee and left. That was the closest Cole Mercer came to acknowledging anything that first week. The second week, he started leaving firewood outside the kitchen door. Not a lot, just enough to top off what she'd already brought in. She noticed it the third morning in a row. He was always gone before she came out to get it. She did not mention it. He did not mention it. Some things on a ranch operate better when they're left unspoken. It was Lily who complicated that arrangement, the way children complicate all arrangements by simply being honest. Lily was not supposed to be in the men's areas. This was the rule. She followed it with a precision that would have made Marin proud, except that it also meant Lily had figured out where the exact boundaries were and had colonized every inch of territory that was technically outside them. She had claimed a spot on the fence post near the south barn, outside the barn, therefore acceptable, where she spent large portions of the afternoon watching the horses and the men who worked with them. She had also, somewhere in the second week, begun talking to Walt Haber. Walt was 61 years old and had been working cattle since before Marin was born, and he was the sort of quiet that is not unfriendly but is not exactly open either. The quiet of a man who had said what needed saying a long time ago and found that saying more didn't usually improve things. He was the last person Marin would have expected Lily to attach herself to. But children pick people for reasons that adults can't always follow. And one afternoon, Marin looked up from the kitchen window and saw Lily sitting on the fence rail and Walt standing below her, leaning on a post. And the two of them were talking. Just talking. Like two people who had decided to be comfortable with each other. She watched it for a moment. Walt was gesturing at something in the distance. The mountains, maybe, or the cloud line. Lily was listening with that particular quality of attention she had, the one that made adults forget they were talking to a 6-year-old. Marin went back to her work. That evening, Lily came in with her cheeks red from cold and sat down at the kitchen bench and said, without preamble, Walt says there's a storm coming. Marin looked up. Did he say when? He said the clouds are doing something they do before a big one. He said he's seen it enough times to know. What kind of big? Lily thought about it. He said the kind that makes the cattle nervous. Marin set down what she was holding. Walt Haber had been on this land for 11 years. He knew its winters the way you know a difficult person after enough years of living with them. Not by what they showed you, but by what they didn't. She dried her hands and went to find Gideon. She found him in the equipment barn, working on a harness with the methodical focus of a man using the task to avoid thinking about something else. She had noticed Gideon did that sometimes. He was not a man who could sit with his thoughts. He needed his hands doing something while his head worked through whatever it was working through. She'd seen her late husband do the same thing. It seemed to be a particular way that certain kinds of men moved through grief. Always in motion, always fixing something, working until the day's end came, and then working a little more. She did not let herself think about that too much. "Mr. Cross," she said. He looked up. "Mrs. Whitmore. Walt Haber thinks a bad storm's coming. He didn't say it directly to me. He told my daughter, which I think was his way of saying it without making a recommendation he wasn't sure was his place to make." Gideon was quiet for a moment, processing this. "Walt usually knows," he said. "I thought so. I wanted to tell you so you could decide what to do with it." He set down the harness. He had that look he got when he was running calculations, pressing his thumbnail absently against the heel of his hand. "If it comes in from the northwest, it'll hit fast. Could be 3-4 days of real weather." "I can manage the food for 3 to 4 days with what we have," she said. "Maybe a day beyond that if I'm careful. But if you have men out on the range when it hits, they need to come in," he said. He said it like a man who already knew it and was just deciding how quickly to move. "That's not my business to say," she said, "but I wanted you to have the full picture." Gideon looked at her then. It was the second time she'd seen that recalibration in his face, that slight adjustment, like a man refocusing on something he'd thought was close but turned out to be closer. "The full picture," he repeated. "The food part," she said. "The rest is yours." He almost smiled. Not quite. It stopped just before it got there, the way his expressions often did, like they had a certain distance they traveled and then halted. "I'll pull the East crew in tomorrow," he said. "Cole won't like it." "Cole doesn't like most things," Marin said, and immediately wished she hadn't. But Gideon made that almost smile again. "No," he said. "He doesn't." He picked up the harness again, then, without looking at her, "Thank you, Mrs. Whitmore." "Marin?" she said. She wasn't sure why she said it right then. She hadn't planned to, it just came out. "You can call me Marin. Mrs. Whitmore was my mother-in-law, and we didn't get along especially well." There was a beat of silence. "Gideon," he said in the same tone. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the stove and felt her pulse doing something it had no business doing, and she gave herself the same 30 seconds she always gave herself, and then she put it away and started planning what she'd need to cook for the next 4 days if they were snowed in. She was not going to be foolish about this. She had a job. She had a daughter. She had exactly 0 room for anything else. The storm came in from the northwest, same as Gideon had predicted. It hit on a Thursday, which she knew because she was still marking days on the paper inside the pantry door, and by Thursday noon the visibility outside the kitchen window had dropped to about 15 feet. By Thursday evening she could barely see the fence post closest to the house. The East crew had come in the day before, Cole included, tight-jawed and unhappy about it. He had stood in the kitchen doorway and watched Marin taking inventory with the look of a man who is annoyed at being proven right about something. "You had something to do with calling us in early," he said. She didn't turn around. "I told Mr. Cross what Walt said." "Walt says things. Doesn't mean they always land." "This one did." Silence. "You trying to manage this ranch or cook for it?" She turned around then. She looked at him directly, the way she'd made herself look at him from that first day on the porch, because the moment she stopped doing that, she would lose the only ground she had. "I'm trying to make sure the people on this ranch have enough to eat no matter what the weather does," she said. "That's my job. Everything I do is in service of that job. If that looks like management to you, I'd ask you to consider what happens when a cook doesn't think about what's coming." Cole held her gaze for a long moment. "Big Ed didn't," he said. "No," she said. "He didn't." Another silence. Something moved across Cole Mercer's face that she couldn't fully read. Not agreement, but not the usual wall either. "Weather looks bad," he said. "I know." "You got enough put up?" "For 4 days, yes. 5 if I'm careful." He nodded. "Once." Then he left. She counted that as something. She wasn't sure what exactly, but something. The storm lasted 3 days and changed one thing permanently. It happened on the second day, when the wind had gotten bad enough that the sound of it came through the walls of the house as a low, continuous moan that made it hard to sleep. Marin was up at 3 in the morning, not because she needed to be, but because she couldn't rest. She went to the kitchen and started the fire and put the coffee on because it was the thing she did when she couldn't sleep and needed to feel useful. She was sitting at the work table with her coffee when she heard Lily's voice from the small room. Not crying, not scared, talking. Marin went to the doorway. Lily was sitting up in the cot with her blanket around her shoulders, fully awake, talking to the wall as if the wall had said something first. It took Marin a moment to understand what was happening. "Who are you talking to?" she said. Lily looked at her. "The wind? What are you saying to it?" "I'm telling it to stop," Lily said, in the matter-of-fact tone she used for things she considered self-evident. "It's being very rude." Marin sat down on the edge of the cot. "Is it working?" Lily listened. The wind continued. "Not yet," she said. Marin put her arm around her daughter, and they sat there in the dark listening to the storm, and Lily leaned against her the way she always did, without thinking about it, without making a production of it, just the automatic lean of a child toward her mother, and Marin sat with it and let herself be leaned on. "Mama," Lily said after a while. "Yeah." "Are we staying here?" Marin was quiet for a moment. "I think so. Do you want to?" Lily considered this seriously. "Walt says the mountains are different here than Montana. He says in Montana they look like they're just there, but here they look like they're watching." "What do you think?" "I think he's right." Lily pulled the blanket up. "I think they're watching to see what we do." Marin looked at her daughter in the dark. 6 years old and already making sense of things in ways that took most people decades. "Then we'll give them something worth watching," she said. Lily settled down against the pillow. "Can you stay?" "For a little while." She stayed until Lily slept, which was not long, and then she went back to the kitchen and sat with her coffee and thought about what she'd said to her daughter and whether she believed it, and decided that she did not need to decide tonight. The storm broke on Friday morning. By noon, the sky had gone the particular clear blue that Wyoming does after weather. The kind of blue that looks like an apology, so intense and clean it almost doesn't seem real. The snow had settled at about 18 inches across the flat ground, and deeper in the drifts against the north side of every structure on the property. The men came out of the bunkhouse into that blue morning like people emerging from something they're not sure is over, cautious and blinking, doing the instinctive survey of what the weather had cost them. Cole walked the fence lines first. He came back 2 hours later and came directly to the kitchen. Marin was making bread. She heard his boots on the porch. He came in without knocking. Nobody knocked in a working ranch kitchen, and he stood for a moment like a man who has decided to say something difficult and is doing final calculations on whether to go through with it. "No major fence damage," he said. "Good. Lost one calf, nothing else." "I'm sorry." "Could have been worse." He looked at the bread dough, back at her. "You knew the storm was going to be bad enough to call the crew in." "Walt knew," she said. "Walt told your daughter," Cole said. "You went to Gideon." "Yes." A long pause. Cole Mercer was not a man who liked owing things to people, and she could see him working through something uncomfortable, the way you see a person deciding whether to take a medicine they know they need but don't want. "If we'd stayed out on the East Range," he started. "I know," she said quietly. "I know." He stood there another moment. Then he walked over to the work table, not toward her but nearby, and picked up a piece of the bread she'd set aside to cool. "You mind?" he said. "No." He ate it standing up. He did not leave. "I grew up in a ranch kitchen," he said, unexpectedly. "My mother cooked for a crew in Colorado. Big operation, 20-some men. She used to say the kitchen was the only honest room on a ranch." Marin kept working. "Why honest?" "Because hungry men don't pretend," he said. "You can tell exactly what they think of the cook by how they eat." "And how do the men here eat?" she asked. Cole looked out the window at the bright blue morning. "Better than they did 2 weeks ago," he said. He put the bread down. He left without saying anything else. It was, in the entire time she had known him, the closest thing to a peace-offering Cole Mercer had ever made. It was imperfect and incomplete and wrapped in a story about his mother rather than anything direct, and she valued it exactly as much as if he'd handed her something wrapped in fine paper. She punched the bread dough once, hard, and felt better. Gideon found her that afternoon making inventory again. She was always making inventory, it felt like. The numbers were different every time, which meant she was actually using things and adjusting and not just going through motions. He came to the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame. which was where he usually stood when he was coming to talk and not sure how long he'd stay. "Crew came through the storm fine," he said. "I heard. One calf." "Could have been worse." He watched her write. "Cole said you were worried about the food lasting." "I was," she said. "But we made it with enough to spare. I stretched it in the right places." "He said you knew what you were doing before the storm hit." She glanced up. "He said that?" "In his way," Gideon said. She went back to her numbers. "He's not a bad man," she said. "He's a man who doesn't trust things that surprise him. I surprised him. Most people don't figure that out about Cole for a long time." "I've worked with a lot of Cole Mercers," she said. "Different names, same shape." Gideon was quiet. Then, "Where did you work before Montana?" She told him. Not everything, she never told everything, because some of it was hers to keep. But she told him enough. The railroad camp, the boarding house before that, the year she'd spent cooking for a lumber outfit in Idaho when Lily was still a baby and Marin was still figuring out how to be both a mother and a person with a job that required everything she had. He listened. He asked one question, which was about the railroad camp. Not prying, just the question of a man trying to understand scale. She told him that one had been the hardest. Largest crew, worse conditions, a sickness that had moved through the camp one winter like something with a grudge. She had cooked through all of it. She had kept people fed when feeding them was the only thing she could do for them. "You've handled a lot," Gideon said. "Everyone handles a lot," she said. "Some people just do it louder." He almost smiled. That almost smile that stopped before it finished. She was beginning to learn the geography of his expressions, what they moved toward and where they stopped. "My wife," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "She would have liked you," he said. It came out with some difficulty, the way things come out when they've been held for a long time. She had no patience for people who made excuses. She used to say, "The only honest work is the work that gets done." Marin kept very still, the way you stay still when something delicate is happening and any movement might end it. "She sounds like she was a good person," she said carefully. "She was," Gideon said. Just those two words, simple and complete, and she understood that 3 years later the loss was still not something he had solved. It was something he was living with, and there is a difference. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people standing near something heavy together, neither of them pretending it wasn't there. "I should let you finish," Gideon said finally. "You don't have to go," she said. Then immediately, I'm just doing numbers. It's not important work. You can stay if—" She stopped herself. She heard how it sounded, and she pressed her lips together. Gideon looked at her for a moment. Something had shifted in the air between them, the way air shifts when pressure changes, subtle and unmistakable. "I've got fence line to check," he said. His voice was perfectly normal, perfectly even. "Of course." He left. Marin set down her pencil and pressed both palms flat on the work table and stared at the inventory list without seeing it for about 15 seconds. "Don't," she told herself. "Just don't." She picked up the pencil, went back to the numbers. The third week brought a different kind of trouble. It arrived not as a storm or a supply shortage or a hostile cowboy, but in the form of a letter that Danny brought back from Clearwater on a Tuesday afternoon when the weather had broken enough to make the road passable. He handed it to her in the kitchen with the particular expression of someone who doesn't know what's in the envelope but can feel from its weight and its return address that it is not nothing. The return address was the employment agency in Cheyenne, the same agency that had hired her. She opened it at the work table with Danny standing nearby, pretending to reorganize a shelf he'd already organized. The letter was polite. Employment agencies always wrote polite letters when they were delivering bad news. She'd learned that. It informed her that the agency had become aware that Mrs. Whitmore had arrived at Black Hollow Ranch with a dependent child, which was contrary to the placement terms agreed upon with the ranch proprietor, Mr. Gideon Cross. It further informed her that Mr. Cross retained the right under the terms of her employment to terminate the placement if the discrepancy was not resolved to his satisfaction, and that the agency would be happy to assist with alternative placement if required. Alternative placement. Like she was a piece of furniture that had been delivered to the wrong house. She read it twice. Then she folded it along its creases and put it in her apron pocket. "Good news?" Danny said, still facing the shelf. "Administrative," she said. She finished the inventory. She made supper. She served it and cleaned up and got Lily to bed and sat alone in the kitchen in the dark. She had two options. She could go to Gideon with the letter tonight, or she could wait until she knew what he was going to say when he said it, whether she was still here on a 2-week grace period that he could end whenever he chose, or whether something had shifted enough that she had real ground to stand on. The 2 weeks were almost up. She made herself think about it honestly. He had called her Gideon. He had stayed in the kitchen to talk when he didn't need to. He had sent the supply order the same morning she'd given him the list. Those were things. But they were small things. A man could do all of those things and still look at the letter from the agency and decide that the simplest path was the easiest one. She had been wrong about simpler paths before. In the morning, she was making biscuits when Gideon appeared in the kitchen doorway earlier than usual. She could tell immediately that he had the letter. He had a copy. The agency had apparently sent one directly to him as well. He held it up. She nodded. "I got mine yesterday," she said. "Danny brought it from town." "Why didn't you tell me?" "I was deciding how to tell you," she said honestly. He came to the work table and set the letter down, not hard, but deliberately. "The agency says the placement is my decision," he said. "I know. They're saying I have grounds to end it." "You do," she said. She kept working. She was not going to stop working to have this conversation. Stopping felt like something she couldn't afford. "You had grounds from the first day. I came here with a child I hadn't disclosed, and that's on me. I made a calculation, and it wasn't entirely fair to you." "Why'd you do it?" he said. It wasn't hostile. It was a real question. A man trying to understand the math of a decision. She looked at him. "Because if I'd told the agency, they wouldn't have placed me. And if I'd written to you directly, you wouldn't have agreed. And I needed this job, and Lily needed a stable place to be. And I knew that I could do this work." She paused. "That doesn't make it right. I know that. But that's why." Gideon stood looking at the letter. "The 2 weeks are up today, he said. "I know." Silence. "Lily was talking to Walt again this morning," he said, outside the south barn. "I'll tell her to—" "Walt told me last night she reminds him of his granddaughter," Gideon said. "He hasn't mentioned her in 2 years." Marin said nothing. Gideon picked up the letter from the agency. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he walked to the stove where the fire was burning low and steady, and he fed the letter into it without ceremony. Just opened the firebox door and slid the paper in. The letter caught immediately. A brief bright flame, and it was gone. He closed the firebox. "I'll write to the agency," he said. "Tell them the placement is satisfactory." Marin set down the biscuit she was shaping. She made herself breathe evenly. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "It's practical. You know what you're doing, and I need someone who knows what they're doing." He paused. There was something working in his face that he was managing carefully. "Besides, the biscuits are good." He left the kitchen. Marin looked at the firebox for a moment, at the thin line of smoke curling up through the grate. Then she went back to the biscuits, pressing her thumbs into the dough the way her mother had taught her 30 years ago in a kitchen smaller than this one, and she did not let herself feel too much about what had just happened, because there was too much of the day still left to get through. But when Lily came in from outside 20 minutes later, pink-cheeked and carrying a question about whether horses could smell storms coming, Marin answered her fully and with more patience than usual, and she let Lily lean against her side while she rolled the biscuit dough, and she did not hurry her out. Some mornings were just better than they had any right to be. She had learned not to question those, just cook through them and be grateful for the heat. The biscuits were good. That was what Gideon had said, and that was what he meant. And Marin understood that for a man like him, it covered a great deal of ground that he did not know how to say directly. She filed it away with the other small things she had been collecting since she arrived, the firewood outside the kitchen door, the almost smile that stopped before it finished, Walt and Lily talking by the south barn fence. She did not build anything out of these things. She just kept them, The way you keep receipts, not because you plan to use them, but because throwing them away feels premature. March came in cold and got colder. The days had a rhythm now that Black Hollow Ranch had not had in a long time, possibly years. Marin could feel it in the way the men moved through the cookhouse. Less like men grabbing what they could before someone noticed, and more like men who expected the meal to be there and trusted that it would be good. That shift in expectation is not a small thing on a working ranch. It changes what people are willing to do in the hours before and after they eat. It changes how they talk to each other. It changes, at some level she couldn't have explained precisely, but knew from long experience how well they work. Cole Mercer had stopped watching her with that waiting for failure look. He had replaced it with something more neutral, the way you look at a piece of equipment that has proven reliable, not warm exactly, but no longer suspicious. She would take it. She had been taking worse from him since the first day, and she was learning the particular discipline required to accept partial progress from a man who measured it out, the way some men measured whiskey. There was one afternoon in early March when the temperature dropped so severely that two of the water pipes in the far end of the cookhouse froze. This was not, in itself, catastrophic. Pipes froze on Wyoming ranches. You dealt with it. What made this particular freezing incident significant was that it happened on the same afternoon that Danny Pruitt managed to knock over the full pot of chili Marion had been building since 8 that morning, and the pot hit the floor, and the chili went across the tile in a wide orange-brown arc that reached the far wall and caught the edge of the woodpile. Danny stood there and looked at it. Marin stood there and looked at it. There was a silence of several full seconds. "I'm so sorry," Danny said. His voice had the quality of a man who has just done something he cannot undo and knows it, and has not yet figured out what comes next. "I tripped on there's a board that's loose by the stove and I'm so sorry, Marin." She looked at the chili, at the wall, at the woodpile, at the clock, which told her the crew would be coming in for supper in just under 2 hours. "Go get Walt," she said. "Walt? And Cal. And the new hand. What's his name? Pete Alcott. Get them and come back." "What are you going to—" "Danny." She said it the way she said things when she needed people to move instead of think. "Go." He went. She was already at the pantry by the time the door swung closed behind him, taking stock with the fast and not entirely calm energy of someone who has had to pivot hard before and knows the only way through it is to move faster than the panic. She had beans, she had salt pork, she had dried corn, and she had onions she'd been saving for Sunday, and she had the smoked sausage she'd been keeping back for a special occasion that hadn't specified itself yet. She had 1 hour and 50 minutes. When Danny came back with Walt and Cal and Pete Alcott, who was 18 and had been on the ranch for 3 weeks, and was still in the phase of doing whatever he was told with gratifying speed, she handed each of them a task without preamble. Walt got the beans on to soak in hot water, an abbreviated soak, which she knew would make them cook uneven, but uneven beans were better than no beans. Cal got the sausage, which she had him slice thin because thin slices cooked faster and the flavor would still carry. Pete got the flour, which was not a cooking task but was necessary before she could function in the space properly. And Danny she put on the bread because the bread was already risen from that morning and just needed shaping and baking, and Danny had seen her do it enough times that she trusted him with the basic version. She ran the chili reconstruction herself. It was not the same chili. It was never going to be the same chili. You cannot build 8 hours of slow cooking in 90 minutes, no matter what you do. What she built instead was something faster and sharper, with more pepper and less depth, the kind of thing that tastes strong and present rather than layered. And she knew the men would eat it because men who have been working in freezing temperatures for 8 hours will eat almost anything that is hot and seasoned. But she wanted it to be more than almost anything. Walt, stirring beans at the back burner, said without looking up, "You're doing that thing your face does when you're not happy with how something's going." "I lost 3 hours of development in that chili," she said. "I know. You can't rush a low simmer." "No," Walt said. "The beans are going to be grainy." "A little." "People will notice." Walt finally looked at her. He had the particular steadiness of someone who had been in enough difficult situations to have developed genuine patience rather than the performed version. "Marin," he said, The men out there have been eating bad food for 4 months. A grainy bean isn't going to register. It registers with me, she said. He looked at her for a moment, then back at his beans. Yeah, he said, in the tone of a man who understands something without needing it explained further. I know it does. She pushed the pepper in harder. She added a splash of the molasses she'd been rationing because the molasses would give it body and sweetness and cover some of the lack of depth, and she adjusted the salt 3 times until it was sitting where she wanted it. And by the time the crew started coming through the door, she had something on that stove that was not what she'd planned, but was hot and real and covered in a smell that hit you before you were fully inside. Cole Mercer was first through, same as always, and he looked at the pot and then at Marin and then at Danny, who was still flour dusted from the bread and had the expression of a man who had survived something. What happened to the floor? Cole said. There was still a faint discoloration near the far wall where Pete had mopped. Spill, Marin said. It's cleaned. Cole looked at the pot again, looked at her. Same chili as this morning? Similar, she said. He served himself. He sat down. He ate. He did not say anything about grainy beans. He went back for a second serving, which he never did except when something was particularly good or he was particularly hungry. She suspected on that particular evening it was some of both. After supper, Danny stayed to help her clean up, which he'd been doing more often. He washed, she dried and put away, and the kitchen had the quiet of a space that has worked hard and is now resting. I'll fix the floorboard, Danny said. Yes, you will, she said. Tomorrow morning before you're up. I'll be up before you. He looked at her sideways. Do you ever actually sleep? 4 hours, she said. It's enough. He was quiet for a while, working through a stack of bowls. Then, you didn't yell at me when I dropped the pot. Would yelling have helped anything? No, but... He stopped, started again. Big Ed would have yelled. Big Ed and I appear to have had different approaches, she said. Big Ed also let the pantry go 3 months without checking what was in it, Danny said. We had a crock of something at the back that had been there so long we couldn't identify it anymore. I found it, Marin said. I threw it away. Danny laughed. A real one, the kind that catches you off guard. Was it bad? It had developed opinions, she said. He was still laughing when he left, and she stood in the clean kitchen for a moment after he was gone and let herself feel the good part of this. The part where she'd handled something difficult and come out the other side with the meal on the table and the crew fed and the kitchen running. It was not perfect. She knew it wasn't perfect, but it was done. And done was something she had learned to value higher than perfect, because perfect required conditions that working life almost never provided. The weeks that followed were, by Wyoming winter standards, manageable. The weather turned worse and then better and then worse again in the way of February edging toward March, and the ranch settled into the deep cold of midwinter the way a large animal settles, with patience and efficiency and the occasional bad-tempered day when everything took longer than it should. Gideon was in the kitchen more often. She noticed this without commenting on it. He would appear in the doorway in the afternoons with some practical question about the supply list, about whether the second pantry shelf needed reinforcing. And the question would get answered, and then sometimes he would stay and sometimes he would not. And she had learned to read which days were which by the particular way he held himself at the doorframe. On the days he was going to stay, he leaned slightly inward. On the days he was going to leave, his weight stayed on his back foot. She was not proud of knowing this. It felt like information she shouldn't have gathered without his permission. But she had cooked for enough people to know that you learn them whether you intend to or not. One afternoon in mid-March, he came in with what she thought was a supply question, and it turned out not to be. He stood at the door for a moment, and she could tell immediately that something was different. He was not quite looking at her, and he was carrying something that had nothing to do with the ranch. You ever think about leaving? He said. She kept her hands in the bread dough she was working. Leaving. The ranch. Going somewhere else. He paused. You've had other offers. She looked up at that. How do you know I've had other offers? Something moved across his face. Danny mentioned a letter came from the Harrow outfit in Clearwater. She put her hands down on the work table and looked at him. Danny needs to mention fewer things, she said. He wasn't being disloyal. He was just... Gideon stopped. He pressed his thumbnail against the doorframe the way he did when he was thinking something he wasn't sure about saying. I'm asking because I want to know if you're planning to go. Marin considered the question seriously, the way he had asked it seriously. The Harrow outfit offered me more money, she said. Better quarters, fewer men to cook for. That's a lot of reasons to go, he said. Yes. But you're still here. I'm still here, she said. He waited. She went back to the bread. Not because she was avoiding the question, but because her hands needed to be doing something, or she would say more than she'd decided to say, and she had a precise idea of where the line was on this particular subject, and she intended to stay on her side of it. I finish things I start, she said. This place needed work. It still does. I'm not done. Gideon was quiet for a long time. The Harrow outfit's a good ranch, he said finally. Good people. I know. You'd be treated well there. Gideon, she said, still working the dough. Why are you trying to talk me into leaving? The silence that followed had a particular quality. She did not look up. I'm not, he said. Sounds like it. He stopped. Started differently. I want you to stay. I want you to know that. I'm saying it directly because I don't seem to be capable of implying it in any way that's clear. He paused. But I also know that what I want and what's right for you and Lily are two different calculations, and I don't want to be the reason you stay somewhere that's not... He stopped again. I'm doing a poor job of this. Yes, she said. I don't practice talking about things, he said. I've noticed. 3 years, he said, and she knew what he meant without needing it spelled out. 3 years of not having anyone to talk to about anything except the ranch. 3 years of the particular silent arithmetic that grief requires. You get out of the habit. She turned around then. She looked at him. He was looking somewhere slightly past her, at the stove or the window beyond it, at something that wasn't in the room. I'm not leaving, she said. Not for the Harrow outfit, not for the money. But I need to say something to you, and I need you to hear it clearly. She waited until he was actually looking at her. I need to know what I am here, because right now I'm the cook who stays late and knows when you lean in at a doorframe and sends supply orders and manages your crew's meals and has apparently become someone you talk to in a kitchen. And I don't mind any of that. But I need to know which version of it I'm living in, because I have Lily, and Lily needs to know where she is. Gideon was completely still. That's fair, he said. Yes, she said. It is. He looked at the floor, back at her. I don't know yet, he said. It was the most honest thing she'd heard him say in weeks, and it landed with the weight of honesty. I'm trying to know. I think that has to be enough for right now. She held that. Okay, she said. He nodded. He left. She stood in the middle of the kitchen for a moment, then turned back to the bread and worked it harder than necessary, and told herself that honesty was better than a clean answer, and mostly believed it. The storm that changed everything came on the last Thursday of March. She knew it was coming 2 days before it arrived, because Walt knew, and because she had learned to watch the sky the way Walt had taught her to watch it. Not for the clouds themselves, but for the quality of light underneath them, which changed in the hours before bad weather in a way that was subtle and entirely unmistakable once you had seen it enough times. But what she had not known, what nobody at Black Hollow Ranch had known, was that the cattle crew that had ridden out to the eastern range 12 days earlier was already riding back. They came in ahead of the storm by about 6 hours, which sounds like enough time until you understand that 6 hours on a Wyoming ranch in late March with 16 men on horseback and a sky that was beginning to do things in the northwest is not a comfortable margin. Marin was in the middle of her evening preparations when Danny came running through the kitchen door in a way that he never ran. He was a careful mover, Danny, the kind of person who watched where he was going, and he nearly hit the work table. East crew's coming in, he said. All of them. She looked at him. All 16? Gideon just got the signal from the ridge. They're maybe 3 hours out. Marin looked at the stove, at the pot on it, which was a modest venison stew she'd built for 14 people, not 30. At the pantry door behind her, which she could inventory in her head without opening it because she had been inventorying it in her head every day for 6 weeks. She thought, 16 men coming in cold and trail exhausted. 3 hours out, storm on their heels. She thought, what do I have and what can I build and how fast? She thought, this is the moment, this exact one. This is why you do the inventory every day. Get Victor Reyes, she said. Danny blinked. The trail cook? He rode out with the East crew. He'll be coming back with them. When they get in, send him to me directly before he does anything else. What do you need from me? She was already at the pantry. Firewood. I need double what's in the box right now. Then go to the root cellar and bring me every potato in there. All of them. And the second smoked ham hanging in the far corner of the supply barn. It's in a cloth sack on the left beam. I need it in the next 20 minutes. Okay, Danny said. He was already moving. She opened the pantry and stood there for 2 full seconds, not because she didn't know what was in it, but because she needed to see it with the new math. 16 more men. No warning. Storm coming. What she had was enough for dinner for her existing crew, full stop. What she needed to build was dinner for 30, plus something. Something beyond basic sustenance, because men coming in after 12 days on a cold range and deteriorating weather needed more than calories. They needed to feel like they'd arrived somewhere. That was the harder problem. The food was a logistics problem. The feeling was a different kind of problem, and it was the one she'd been solving her whole life. She pulled the dried beans. She pulled the remaining cornmeal. She found the backup lard she'd put by in October. She had molasses, not a lot, but enough. She had dried apples, almost a full crock. She'd been saving them for no specific reason except that dried apples kept well, and you never knew. She was heating the second oven when Gideon appeared in the kitchen. He looked at what she was doing, and then at her, and then at the volume of ingredients on the work table, and she could see him calculating. You heard, he said. Danny told me. 16 men, he said. We weren't expecting them for another week. I know. She didn't stop moving. The storm pushed them back. Victor Reyes is with them? He should be. I need him in here as soon as they ride in. Gideon nodded. What do you need from me? She looked at him. It was still sometimes a surprise when he said that, when he just asked without building a whole structure around it. The second cook stove in the supply barn. Can someone get it lit and moved closer to the main cookhouse? If I'm running 2 full preparations, I need the extra heat source. Cole can do it. Cole's going to say it's too much trouble. Cole'll do it, Gideon said. He left. She heard, a few minutes later, Cole Mercer's voice from outside. Not happy, but working. She let herself feel a small satisfaction at that, and then put it away and focused. The next 3 hours were the hardest cooking hours of her time at Black Hollow Ranch. They were not the hardest of her life. That remained a winter in a railroad camp where she'd cooked for 200 men with 1 working stove and a helper who was sick in a supply situation that could be charitably described as dire, but they were close. Victor Reyes arrived exactly when she needed him, which was 40 minutes into her preparation, when she had multiple things happening at different stages and needed a second pair of hands that knew what they were doing. He was a short, solid man in his late 40s with dark eyes and the particular economy of movement that experienced cooks develop. No wasted motion, no reaching for things twice, no standing and thinking when he could be moving and thinking. He came into the kitchen, took one look at what she was building, and said, How many and how long? 30 people, 40 minutes, she said. He looked at the pots, at the oven, at the work table. He nodded. What do you need? Beans are your job. The molasses is in the pantry, 3rd shelf. Go heavy with it. These men need something that'll sit with them tonight. Done. He moved to the stove without another word. They did not talk much after that. They didn't need to. She had worked with trail cooks before, and she recognized what Victor Reyes was, a man who had been cooking in outdoor conditions for a long time and had developed the particular intelligence of someone who learned to make things work with what was available rather than mourning what wasn't. They moved around each other in the kitchen, the way people move around each other when they've settled a territory without needing to negotiate it, each taking the space they needed without crowding the other. At the 40-minute mark, she looked at what they had and made the decision that she always made in situations like this one. The potatoes were going to be plain because they'd run out of time for anything but plain. The venison stew would stretch because Victor had suggested adding the remaining stock from the second pantry, which she'd initially resisted because she'd been saving it for next week, and then she stopped resisting because next week was not the problem in front of her right now. She had been saving the dried apples. She looked at them for a long moment. "You making something?" Victor said from the stove. "Trying to decide." "Dried apple cake takes 40 minutes if you rush it," he said. "I saw your oven temp. You're running hot enough." She looked at the clock, at the apples, at the molasses she had left. "It'll be flat," she said. "It'll be warm," he said. "Men who've been 12 days on a trail don't care if the cake's flat." She made the cake. It was flat. The center didn't set quite right, and the edges were closer to crisp than they should have been, and it was the kind of thing she would have been quietly disappointed in under normal circumstances. But she cut it into pieces and set it in the middle of the table and stepped back, and when the first wave of the East crew came through the cookhouse door and hit the smell of warm apple and molasses, the man closest to the front, a big rider named Joe Sutter, who she'd never met, stopped walking entirely and stood in the doorway and said, to no one in particular, "Is that cake?" "Yes," Danny said from behind him. Joe Sutter sat down without another word. Marin stood at the edge of the cookhouse and watched them come in. 16 men in various states of cold and exhaustion, still in their trail coats, boots caked with snow, faces marked by 12 days of outdoor living in temperatures that had not been kind. They came in and they sat down, and she watched the room change the way a room changes. When cold people get warm and hungry people get fed and tired, people are allowed to stop moving. It was the thing she had always known how to do. It was the reason she did what she did. Not the cooking itself, though she loved the cooking, but this. The shift in a room, the moment when something that was tight and worn down and braced for more difficulty allowed itself just briefly to unclench. She was still watching it when she became aware of someone standing beside her. She looked over. The man standing next to her was older than most of the crew. Not old, but with the settled quality of someone past 60, with white in his beard and crow's feet so deep they looked permanent. He was still in his trail coat, and he had his hat in his hand, and he was looking at her with an expression she could not immediately read. "You the cook here?" he said. "Yes," she said. "I'm Marion Whitmore." He was quiet for a long moment. "Then, you ever work a railroad camp somewhere up north of Laramie? Maybe 8, 9 years back?" She looked at him. "Elias Ford," he said. "I was a line rider on the Crawford job, winter of 1881. She felt something shift in her chest. Not shock exactly. More like the sensation of something you've kept in a closed room for a long time when someone opens the door. "I remember that winter," she said carefully. "So do I," Elias Ford said. He was looking at her like a man who has spent a long time being sure about something and is confirming that sureness. "There was a sickness that came through in February, took down a third of the camp. They couldn't get a doctor in because the roads were gone and the temperature had dropped to something I don't have a polite word for." He paused. "But there was a cook. Young woman. Couldn't have been more than 25, 26 at the most. She kept that kitchen running for 22 days straight, cooked for the sick and the well both. Rationed what they had so nobody starved, kept people hydrated when the sickness made it hard to take anything solid." He stopped again. He was looking at Marin very directly. "I've thought about that woman 100 times since, about how she kept her head when everyone else had lost theirs, about what it cost her to do that." The cookhouse was loud with the sounds of 30 men eating and the fire in the stove and the wind picking up outside as the storm moved closer. Marin said nothing. "That was you," Elias Ford said. It was not a question. She held his gaze. "I was very young," she said. "You saved people's lives." "I fed people," she said. "The living and the sick both. That's all I knew how to do." Elias Ford looked at her for another long moment. Then he looked out at the cookhouse, at the 30 men eating, at the flat apple cake going around the table, at Cole Mercer, who had come in from setting up the second stove and was eating his third bowl of stew, at Danny Pruitt, who was refilling coffee with the easy efficiency he'd developed over the past 6 weeks. At Walt Haber, who had maneuvered himself into the seat beside a young rider named Amos, who looked about 17 and like he had not been warm in a week, and was talking to him quietly the way Walt talked to people he decided needed something without asking for it. "All I knew how to do," Elias Ford repeated. He said it the way you say something when it contains much more than its surface. She looked at him. He put his hat back on his head. "I'll let you get back to work," he said. "But I want you to know, some of us remember what you did in that camp. We didn't know your name, but we remembered you." He went to the table and found a seat, and she stood where she was for a moment, and then she went back to the kitchen because the bread needed checking and Victor was already washing up at the basin and the storm outside was hitting the north wall of the cookhouse with the first real force of what it intended to do tonight. She checked the bread. It was done. She stood at the open oven a moment longer than necessary, letting the heat come out at her face, and she breathed it in. Wood smoke and apple and yeast and the particular complicated smell of a kitchen that has been worked hard. And she did not let herself feel everything that Elias Ford's words had stirred up, because there was too much of the night still left, and she was the one keeping it together, and that had to come first. Victor Reyes came up beside her and looked at the bread. "Not bad," he said, "for a rush job." "It'll do," she said. "Whole thing'll do," he said. He picked up his coat from the hook. "You run a tight kitchen, Whitmore. I've worked with a lot of cooks. Not many of them would have pulled off what you just did tonight." "You did half of it," she said. "I did my half," he said. "You did yours. That's how it's supposed to work." He buttoned his coat. "Storm's gonna be bad tonight." "I know." "You need me tomorrow. I'm here." "Thank you, Victor." He left, and she stood alone in the kitchen after he was gone, and outside the storm hit with a sound like something being decided. And inside the cookhouse, the men were eating and talking and warming up. And she put both palms flat on the work table the way she sometimes did when she needed to feel something solid. And she stood like that for exactly 30 seconds. Then she went back out to check on her people. The storm lasted 2 days. Not the worst storm Black Hollow Ranch had seen. Walt said that distinction belonged to a January blow 3 years back that had killed 4 head and kept the men housebound for 6 days. But bad enough. Bad enough that the sound of it became something you stopped hearing after a while, the way you stop hearing a train when you live near the tracks. Bad enough that by the second morning, the men in the bunkhouse had developed that particular restless quality of large working men who have been still too long, which Marion recognized as a management problem as much as a weather problem. She handled it the way she handled most problems, with food. On the first storm day, she made everything she had been saving. Not because the emergency required it, but because 30 men cooped up with nothing to look forward to will find things to argue about, and giving them something to look forward to at noon and at supper was cheaper than whatever the alternative produced. She made the second smoked ham she'd been holding back. She made a proper pudding with the last of the good sugar. She kept the coffee pot running from 5 in the morning until 9 at night. The second storm day, she baked bread 3 times. The smell of it moved through the cookhouse and into the bunkhouse through the shared wall, and by 10 in the morning, she had men finding reasons to appear in the kitchen doorway that had nothing to do with any official purpose. Cole Mercer came through at 11 with a piece of tack that needed re-examining in better light, and she gave him a heel of bread with lard on it, and he took it without comment and stood at the window for a few minutes looking at the white nothing outside. "Second day's always worse," he said. "For the men or the weather," she said. "Both." He ate the bread. "Elias Ford's been talking this morning." She kept her hands moving. "About what?" "About you." Cole looked at her sideways. "About the railroad camp." She said nothing. "How come you never mentioned it?" he said. "It wasn't relevant." "It's pretty relevant." He set down the tack on the windowsill. "Marin, the man saying you kept 200 people fed and alive through a sickness outbreak in conditions he says were, and I'm quoting him directly here, the kind of conditions that make a man reconsider his life choices." "Elias Ford likes a good story," she said. "He doesn't strike me as someone who exaggerates." She turned around and looked at Cole Mercer. He was leaning against the windowsill with his arms crossed. and the particular expression he got when he was working through something that had changed his previous position, which she had learned was not an expression he wore comfortably. Cole Mercer did not enjoy being wrong. He was not a man who managed it with grace, but he was also, she had come to understand, a man who could not sustain a position he'd identified as incorrect. It sat badly with him in a way that required resolution. "What is it you want to say to me, Cole?" she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I dropped your bag in the snow," he said. "Yes." "First day you arrived." He was looking at the window now, not at her. That was a lousy thing to do." She let the silence sit for a moment. "Yes," she said. "It was." Lily was there. She was. He pressed his mouth together. "I've got a sister," he said. "Younger. She came out west with her husband and it was about 4 years ago now. 2 kids, both small. I saw her off at the station, and the whole time I was thinking about what she was riding into, whether there'd be people where she was going who'd take one look at her with those 2 babies, and..." He stopped. "Point being, I know what it is to have someone do that to a woman who's just arrived somewhere and doesn't know anybody." Marin set down what she was doing. "Your sister," she said. "Is she all right?" He looked at her then, slightly surprised. "Yeah, she's good. They're in Colorado now. Got a place." "Good," Marin said. She meant it. He picked up the tack. He was quiet for a moment. "I was wrong about you from the start," he said. "I want to say that directly. I made a decision before you opened your mouth, and I held on to it longer than I should have." He paused. "I'm sorry for the bag and for the rest of it." It was not a polished apology. It had rough edges, and it came out in pieces, and he was looking at the floor through most of it. But it was real, which was worth more to her than polished, and she received it the way she received most things that cost people something, without making more of it than they wanted made of it. "Thank you," she said. "That means something." He nodded. Once. Then he left with the tack and the remnant of the bread and did not look back, which was fine, which was exactly right. She stood in the kitchen after he left and took a breath that was slightly more unsteady than she would have liked, and then she went back to work. The storm broke on Saturday morning, same clear blue as the last one, the sky doing its apologetic performance, everything white and still and brilliant. The men came out of the bunkhouse and the cookhouse in stages, blinking, starting the long process of assessing what needed to be done and in what order. Elias Ford found Gideon at the fence line south of the main barn, where Gideon had gone first thing to check a section that had been worrying him before the storm. Marin didn't see this conversation. She heard about it later from Danny, who had the particular gift of knowing most things that happened on the ranch without appearing to be watching. Elias had apparently told Gideon the full version, not the abbreviated thing he'd said to Marin in the cookhouse, but the whole account. The railroad camp, the sickness, the 22 days, the names of men who had made it through partly because there had been a young cook who refused to stop working. He had told Gideon about a specific night in the 3rd week when the situation had been at its worst, when 2 men were down and the temperature had dropped to something brutal and the camp was as close to breaking as it had come. And Marion, he hadn't known her name, he'd called her the cook, the young one, had stayed up the entire night making broth and carrying it to every man who couldn't get to the cookhouse himself. He had told Gideon that he'd never seen anyone work like that he'd thought about it for 8 years, that he wanted Gideon to understand what kind of person he had working in his kitchen. Gideon had apparently not said much in response. Danny said he'd just listened and then thanked Elias and gone back to looking at the fence. But that afternoon, Gideon came to the kitchen. He came in without a question this time. No supply list, no practical errand. He sat down at the work table and she poured him coffee without asking, the same as she always did, and he held it and did not drink it for a while. "Elias Ford talked to me this morning," he said. "I heard," she said. "Did he tell you he was going to?" "No, but I'm not surprised." Gideon looked at the coffee. "The railroad camp," he said. "You've never said anything about it." "No." "Why?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "Because it wasn't something I wanted to trade on," she said. I came here for a job. I wanted to keep it on the basis of the work I was doing here. What I did somewhere else 8 years ago. That's a different story. It's the same person, he said. Yes, she said. But the work is the work. Either I'm doing it well enough here to justify keeping me, or I'm not. What happens somewhere else doesn't change that math. Gideon was quiet for a long time. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Not drinking, just turning it. She had noticed he did that when he was approaching something he didn't quite know how to get to directly. My wife was sick, he said. She went still. It wasn't the same kind of sick as what you dealt with in that camp. It was slower. He set the cup down. 2 years. She knew and I knew, and we spent most of it not saying what we knew because saying it out loud seemed like it would make it happen faster. Which is not logical, but grief doesn't run on logic. He looked at the window. There was a woman who came in, a nurse from Clearwater. She stayed for 6 weeks near the end. She did what needed doing. She was kind about it. He paused. I've thought since that I never thanked her properly. I was still in the part where you can't fully process what's happening. You just move through it. Marin did not say anything. She understood she was being told something that had not been told often, maybe not at all since it happened, and the right response to that was to receive it quietly and not fill the space around it with words. Elias said you carried broth to every man who couldn't get to the cookhouse, Gideon said. In the worst of it, all night. They needed to stay hydrated, she said. It came out more plainly than she intended. That's not why you did it, he said. He said it simply, not as a challenge. She looked at him. No, she said, it's not. He looked at her. She said, when someone is sick and scared and far from home, being brought something warm by someone who is calm and not afraid, that is sometimes almost as important as the thing itself, sometimes more. She paused. I couldn't make them better. I could make them less alone. That was the part I could do. Gideon sat with that. You've been doing that here, he said. The whole time. Not just the food. Making people less alone. He looked slightly uncomfortable with the phrase, as though he'd said something he hadn't meant to say that loudly. It's the same job, she said. He was quiet again. Then, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, even if the honest answer is something I don't want to hear. All right. Are you happy here? It was not the question she'd expected. She had been ready for something practical. Something about the Harrow outfit offer, or the supplies, or something to do with Lily and the schooling question she'd been putting off raising with him. She had not been ready for that particular question. She thought about it genuinely. Not what she should say, what was true. I'm not unhappy, she said, which is not the same thing as happy, and I know that. But I haven't. In a long time, I haven't had a place where I could see myself building something, just moving through, doing the work, and then moving on to the next place. She looked at the kitchen around her, the stove she'd repaired, the pantry door Danny had fixed, the inventory list that had become almost a kind of record of the ranch's winter. This feels different. I don't know what to do with that yet. Neither do I, Gideon said. But I think that means something. She looked at him. I think it means we're both standing at the same thing, he said, and neither of us knows what to call it yet. She could have said something there. She had the words, and she knew what they were. But she also knew that there is a time for words, and a time for letting things be what they are a little longer without naming them, because naming things too soon sometimes pins them into shapes they hadn't finished taking. More coffee? She said. He looked at her for a moment. That almost smile. Yeah, he said. Thank you. She poured it, and he stayed a little longer, and they talked about the fence line and the spring calving schedule, which was the real business of the ranch in the coming weeks. And when he left, he took the conversation with him, which was fine. It would find its way back. Things that mattered always did. The revelation about the railroad camp moved through the ranch the way things move through isolated communities, without a formal announcement but completely and quickly, the way water finds every crack. By Sunday noon, most of the men who had been on the East Range knew. By Sunday evening, the men who had been at the ranch the whole time knew. Marin could not have said exactly how she knew that they knew, but she could feel the shift in the cookhouse the way you feel a change in air pressure. Something fundamental had adjusted. It was not that they treated her differently in obvious ways. There were no speeches. Nobody said anything dramatic. But the quality of the room had changed, the same way a room changes when a question that has been sitting in it for a long time gets quietly answered. Amos, the young rider who had come in trail-worn from the East Range and whom Walt had taken under his wing at supper 2 nights before, appeared in the kitchen doorway on Sunday morning and asked if there was anything he could do. He said it in the way 19-year-olds say things they mean, but aren't entirely sure how to say. A little stiff, a little formal, the words not quite fitting the intention. "Can you peel potatoes?" Marin asked. "Yes, ma'am. There's a bucket by the pantry." He peeled potatoes for an hour and did not say much, which was fine. And when he left, he said thank you in the same stiff way, and she said, "You're welcome," and that was that. But he came back on Monday. And on Tuesday, he brought Pete Alcott with him, and the two of them peeled potatoes and washed dishes and did not get in her way. And she registered that these were young men who had heard a story about her and decided to respond to it not with words, but with showing up. Which was, she had always believed, the most honest possible response to anything. Walt noticed. Walt noticed everything, filtered it through 61 years of watching people, and arrived at observations that were almost always correct. "You're accumulating assistance," he said one afternoon, watching Pete Alcott carry a bucket of water with the focused expression of someone performing a task they consider important. "I'm managing a kitchen," she said. "You're building something," he said. "Same way you built the supply system and the inventory. Same way you built the cooking schedule and the bread rotation." He paused. "Same way you rebuilt that stove seal the first week." She looked at him. "You noticed that?" "Gideon noticed it first," Walt said. "He told me about it. Said a woman who showed up and fixed a problem nobody'd bothered to fix in 2 years before they even unpacked their bag was either someone worth keeping or someone running from something." He let that sit. He decided it was the former. "When did he decide that?" she asked. "About 48 hours in," Walt said. "He just wasn't saying it yet." She went back to the stove, and she thought about Gideon Cross deciding in the first 2 days that she was worth keeping, and then writing a letter to the employment agency 2 weeks later saying the placement was satisfactory, and said nothing about it because Walt was not telling her this to get a reaction from her. He was telling her because he was an old man who had watched a lot of people and liked it when things went the right direction and felt it was occasionally acceptable to give them a small push. The push landed. She was thinking about it that evening when Lily came in from outside with snow on her boots, and her cheeks so red they were almost purple, and announced that Amos had taught her how to whistle. "Can you?" Marin said. Lily demonstrated. It was not technically a whistle. It was an earnest movement of lips and a great deal of breath, and a sound that was somewhere in the vicinity of what Amos had intended. "That's good," Marin said seriously. "He says if I practice, I can do it through my fingers," Lily said, "like a real signal whistle, for calling horses." "You don't have a horse." "Not yet," Lily said. She said it with the particular calm confidence of a 6-year-old who has made a decision about the future and sees no particular obstacle. Marin looked at her daughter, at the snow melting off her boots and the absolute certainty in her face, and the way she'd said not yet the same way she said most things, as a statement of what was coming rather than what was wanted. "Wash your hands," Marin said. "Supper in 20 minutes. Lily washed her hands. She set the table without being asked, which she had started doing 2 weeks ago, working out which side the spoon went on by herself and getting it right. She folded the napkins into rough triangles because she'd seen Marin do it that way once and decided it was the proper method. When the men came in for supper and found the napkins folded into triangles, nobody commented on it. They just used them. That was the thing about Black Hollow Ranch that Marin had not expected and had come to understand slowly, over weeks. These men, who had laughed on the porch the day she arrived, who had expected her to fail, who had held their judgments in front of them like shields, these same men had a capacity for simple acceptance that she had not given them credit for. Once the ground shifted, they did not resist the shift. They just adapted the way working people adapt to things that work. She had seen Cole Mercer apologize, imperfectly and genuinely. She had seen Walt Haber attach himself to her daughter like a patient, permanent fixture. She had seen Danny Pruitt fix a floorboard and wash dishes and carry water because he had decided she was someone worth showing up for. She had seen 30 men eat a flat apple cake in a storm and feel grateful for it. She had underestimated them. Not as much as they'd underestimated her, but some. April came without ceremony. The snow was still there, because in Wyoming the snow is always still there in April, but the quality of the light changed. The days got longer in a way you felt before you could measure it. Something in the angle of the late afternoon light through the kitchen window that was different from what it had been in February, warmer in color, less like pewter and more like brass. It was the kind of change that made you notice, even when you were busy, even when you were deliberately not thinking about things you weren't ready to think about. Marin noticed it on a Tuesday afternoon when she was standing at the kitchen window watching Lily and Walt at the south fence, the same spot they'd been meeting for 2 months now. Lily was telling Walt something long and complicated, using her hands the way she did when a story had geography, and Walt was listening with his head tilted slightly, the way he always listened. She watched them for longer than she'd intended. She was still watching when she heard footsteps on the porch, different from Danny's, different from Cole's, different from the quick, purposeful stride of any of the ranch hands. Gideon had a particular weight to his step that she had learned the same way she'd learned all of it, without meaning to, just by paying attention over a long time. He came to the kitchen doorway. "There's a man coming from the Ridgeline outfit," he said. "Supposed to arrive tomorrow. He's looking to hire experienced ranch cooks. He's building a new crew, and he's been asking around." She turned from the window. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "You know." "Danny told me last week. He felt bad about telling me, but he thought I should know." Gideon let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Danny needs to—" "He's loyal," she said. "He was being loyal to me. I'm not going to hold it against him." Gideon came into the kitchen and stood at the work table, not sitting, just standing with his hands on the surface and looking at her with the expression she'd come to recognize as the one he wore when he was finally getting to the thing he'd been working toward for a while. "I don't want you to go talk to him," he said. "I wasn't going to," she said. "I know, but I wanted to say it." He paused. "I wanted to say it directly for once, instead of assuming you knew what I meant." She looked at him. "What else do you want to say directly?" He pressed his lips together. It was not that he didn't know the words. She could see the words in his face, could see him carrying them. It was that saying them was the act of opening a door that had been closed for 3 years, and the weight of that was real, and she did not want to pretend it wasn't. "I want to say," he started, "that when you arrived here in February, I saw a problem. A widow with a child that I hadn't agreed to and didn't know how to handle. And I want to say that at some point, I couldn't tell you exactly when, that changed. Not slowly the way I might have expected. More like one day I just noticed it had already changed without asking my permission." She said nothing. "I want to say that I know I'm not an easy man," he continued. "I know I don't talk enough, and I work too much, and I put myself in the barn when I should probably be somewhere else. I know those things about myself. I don't think I'm going to be fundamentally different than that." "I'm not asking you to be," she said quietly. "I know," he said. "That's part of it. That's part of what I'm trying to say." He looked at her. "You've never once asked me to be different. You just worked around the parts of me that weren't ideal and kept going. I've noticed that." "I've worked around a lot of things," she said. "It's not a particular skill. It's just what you do when the rest of it is worth it." Something moved in his face at that. "Is it?" he said. "Worth it?" She looked at him for a long moment. At the man who had almost smiled at her for 2 months, who had stood in doorways and asked practical questions and burned a letter in a stove and told her about his wife with the careful difficulty of someone handling something they weren't sure they were allowed to touch yet. "Yes," she said. "It is." Gideon exhaled. She hadn't realized until that moment how much he'd been holding that question and the answer to it, and what the answer might cost him either way. He moved from the work table to where she was standing, which was not far. The kitchen was not big. And he stopped close enough that this was clearly intentional, clearly a choice he was making with the full awareness of what it meant. He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just picked it up from where it was resting against the stove and held it in both of his, which were rough from 38 years of outdoor work and warm despite the cold he'd just come in from. "I'm asking you to stay," he said. "Not as the cook. As—" He stopped, started again. "I want to do this right. I want to say it right." "You don't have to say it perfectly," she said. "I want to," he said. There was something almost stubborn in it, the way a man is stubborn when he's decided something matters enough to do it properly. She waited. "I want you and Lily to stay," he said. "I want you here, not as an employee, not as someone I can lose to the Ridgeline outfit or the Harrow outfit or anyone else who offers better quarters. I want us to build this place together." He paused. "If that's something you want, if that's something you can— I know it's soon. I know I'm not always—" "Gideon," she said. He stopped. "It's not too soon," she said. "It's been a whole winter, a whole Wyoming winter. That's not nothing." He looked at her. "No," he said. "It's not." She thought about Lily whistling on the kitchen bench, about Walt at the fence, about the mountains that watched to see what you'd do. She thought about carrying broth through a frozen camp because it was the only thing she could do, and about a letter burning in a stove, and about 30 men eating a flat cake in a storm and feeling grateful. She thought about what it meant to build something as opposed to just occupying a place. "Yes," she said. "We'll stay." His hands tightened slightly around hers, not dramatically, just present, real and present and warm. Outside, through the kitchen window, Lily had apparently successfully produced a whistle, because she could hear the sound of it, thin and wavering and triumphant, carrying across the cold April air from the south fence, where Walt Haber was undoubtedly standing with the expression of a man trying not to look too pleased with himself. Lily's whistle hung in the April air for about 3 seconds before dissolving into the wind, but those 3 seconds were enough. Walt Haber's face, visible through the kitchen window, did exactly what Marin had predicted. The careful blankness of a man trying not to look too proud of something that had nothing to do with him professionally. She turned away from the window. Gideon was still holding her hand. He seemed to have noticed this at the same moment she looked back, and he released it with the slight self-consciousness of a man who had not planned to hold someone's hand in a kitchen for that long and wasn't entirely sure of the protocol for ending it gracefully. "I should—" he started. "There's fence line," she said. "Yes. And the Ridgeline man comes tomorrow." "I'll handle that," he said. "I know you will." He looked at her for a moment more. Then he left, and she listened to his boots on the porch and across the yard, and she turned back to the stove and stood there with her hands resting on the warming rail, not doing anything for about 30 seconds, which was twice her usual allotment. Then she started making supper. The Ridgeline man came the next morning, as promised. His name was Barrett Holt, and he was the kind of man who announced himself with his posture before he said a word. Broad shoulders squared deliberately, hat worn at an angle that suggested he'd thought about it. He had a pleasant face and the specific ease of someone who had made a lot of offers to a lot of people and expected them to say yes. Marin saw him ride in from the kitchen window. She watched him tie his horse at the post and straighten his coat and look at the property the way men look at properties when they're deciding what they think of it. She went back to her bread. Gideon met him outside. She could not hear the conversation, but she could see it through the window in pieces. The handshake, the gesturing toward the main barn, and then back toward the house. The particular posture of 2 men conducting business they both understand the shape of. Barrett Holt talked more than Gideon, which did not surprise her. After about 15 minutes, Gideon pointed toward the cookhouse, and Marin understood she was about to have a visitor. She was pulling the first loaves from the oven when Barrett Holt appeared in the kitchen doorway. He looked at the bread. At the kitchen, which was clean and organized in the specific way that a working kitchen is clean and organized, not showpiece clean, but functional clean, everything in a place that made sense, nothing wasted. He looked at the inventory list she kept pinned to the pantry. He looked at her. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said. He had been told her name. I'm Barrett Holt from the Ridgeline Ranch over near Cody. I expect you know why I'm here. I do, she said. She set the bread on the cooling rack and turned to face him properly, because this deserved her full attention even if her answer did not require much thought. I'll be direct, he said. I'm building a crew for a new operation, bigger than what you've got here. 35 men at full roster, possibly 40 come summer. I need a head cook with real experience managing large-scale ranch feeding, supply logistics, the whole operation. The pay is 40% more than what you're receiving here. He paused. I've asked around. People speak very well of your work. Thank you, she said. I'd want you to start in May. She looked at him. He was not a bad man. She could tell that. He was efficient and direct, and he had taken the time to find out who she was before he came, which spoke to a certain thoroughness she respected. Under different circumstances, in a different winter, she would have been interested in what he was offering. Mr. Holt, she said, I'm grateful for the offer. I mean that genuinely. But I'm not available. He paused. He had clearly expected some negotiation. The pay, it's not the pay, she said. The quarters? I can tell you the facilities at Ridgeline are... Mr. Holt, she said it kindly but clearly, the way you say things when you want them to land without landing hard. I'm not leaving Black Hollow. I've decided to stay. That decision isn't about the terms. He studied her for a moment. Then something in his posture relaxed slightly. The particular relaxation of a man who has been in enough negotiations to know when one is genuinely over. Cross is a lucky man, he said. He's worked for what he has, she said. Barrett Holt almost smiled. Fair enough. He looked around the kitchen one more time, at the bread, at the lists, at the organized pantry. If you ever change your mind, the offer stands for 60 days. I won't change my mind, she said, but thank you. He tipped his hat and left. She heard him and Gideon exchange a few words outside, brief, businesslike, and then the sound of a horse leaving the yard. Gideon appeared in the doorway about 2 minutes later. He looked at her. He came to see you, he said. Not a question. He did. And? I told him I wasn't available. She turned back to the bread. I told him I'd decided to stay. A pause. You told him you'd decided. It seemed cleaner than explaining, she said. He was quiet for a moment. She could feel him standing in the doorway, not quite at ease, not quite at whatever the opposite of ease was either. Something in between, a man recalibrating again, which she had come to think of as his natural state, when things moved in directions he hadn't expected but didn't want to stop. Marin, he said. The bread needs another few minutes, she said. Don't distract me. She heard him exhale. It had a quality of something released, not dramatically, just quietly, the way pressure releases from something that's been holding it. He stayed until the bread was done. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. The weeks that followed had a different quality than the weeks before. Not in the practical sense. The ranch ran the same, the work was the same. Marin was in the kitchen at 5 in the morning, the same as she had been since February. But the quality of the days had shifted in the way that everything shifts when something unspoken finally gets spoken. There was less tension in the space between things. The silences were a different kind. Lily noticed first because Lily noticed most things. You and Gideon are different now, she announced one evening, sitting on the kitchen bench while Marin cleaned up from supper. Marin kept scrubbing. Different how? You don't look at each other the same way. How did we look at each other before? Lily thought about it with the seriousness she applied to most questions. Like you were both pretending not to look, she said. Marin set down the brush. And now? She said. Now you just look, Lily said simply. There was not much to say to that, so Marin went back to scrubbing, and Lily went back to the small drawing she'd been making on a piece of paper Danny had given her, which appeared to be a horse with a whistle coming out of its mouth, and the kitchen was quiet in the good way. The conversation about what came next happened on a Sunday, which was the one day Marin allowed herself to make breakfast a little later and supper a little simpler, not because anyone had asked, but because she had decided that a crew that worked 7 days a week deserved at least one day with a slightly different shape. Gideon found her in the kitchen after noon, which was the quietest part of Sunday. when most of the men were resting or writing letters or doing the small personal maintenance tasks that working weeks never left room for. He sat at the work table. She poured coffee. This had become so automatic between them that neither of them acknowledged it happening. "I want to ask you something," he said. "You've been working up to it since Thursday," she said. "I wondered when you'd get there." He looked at her. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to me," she said, "and possibly Walt." He pressed his thumbnail against the edge of the table, the thinking gesture she'd catalogued months ago. "I want us to make this formal," he said. "Legal. I want to marry you, Marin. I want Lily to have a proper home here, with a name attached to it that means she belongs here. And I want you to have—" He stopped. Tried again. "I want you to have what you've built here, in your name, not as an employee, and not as someone staying because they have nowhere else to go." She looked at him. I know I'm not delivering this the way a man is supposed to deliver this sort of thing," he said. "How is a man supposed to deliver it?" she asked. "I don't know. Better than this." "I disagree," she said. He waited. "You said what you meant," she said. "That's better than most." He looked at her directly. "Will you?" She thought about the woman who had stepped off a stagecoach in February with a patched travel bag and a 6-year-old daughter and $40 and a letter from an employment agency, and about the men on that porch, and about the bag in the snow, and about standing in a neglected kitchen at noon on a freezing day and making herself think only about the next practical thing, because the next practical thing was survivable. She thought about broth carried through a frozen camp at 3 a.m, about a letter burning in a firebox, about Lily's boots lined up by a cot in a storage room that had become, against all reasonable expectation, a place they wanted to be. "Yes," she said, "but I need you to understand something first." "Tell me." "I'm not going to become someone different," she said. "I'm not going to stop having opinions about the supply order or the cruise meals or the things on this ranch that I think could be done better. I'm not going to ask your permission before I fix what needs fixing. I'm not going to make myself smaller because the arrangement changed." "I know that," he said. "You know it now. I'm asking you to still know it in 3 years." He held her gaze. "I'd be disappointed if you changed," he said. "This ranch runs better because of how you are. I run better because of how you are." She took a breath. "Then yes," she said. "I will." He reached across the table and took her hand again, same as he had the first time. Just picked it up and held it in both of his, which were still rough and still warm. He was not going to be a man who changed that much. He was going to be exactly who he'd been, with all the edges and the silence and the almost smiles, and she had decided weeks ago that this was not a problem to solve, but a person to know. She squeezed his hand once and then went back to her coffee, and he sat with her for a long time without needing to fill the air with anything else. They married in May, on the first warm Saturday the month produced, which in Wyoming is never as warm as the word suggests, but was warm enough. Walt Haber stood up for Gideon. Lily stood up for Marin, which Lily had negotiated for herself with a calm that suggested she'd decided this was her right, several weeks before anyone had thought to discuss it. Cole Mercer wore his good jacket, which Danny mentioned quietly to Marin, was something he only did for things he considered genuinely significant. When she looked at Cole during the small ceremony in the yard, she caught the expression he didn't quite manage to put away in time. Not sentiment, because Cole Mercer was not a sentimental man, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man who had been wrong about something important and had watched it become right and was glad, quietly and without fanfare, that he had lived to see it. She did not mention that she'd seen it. Neither did he. The meal afterward was the largest she had cooked at Black Hollow Ranch, that was not driven by emergency. A real meal, made with time and care. The kind of meal where all the components finished at the right moment and nothing had to be rushed or compensated for. Victor Reyes rode over from the East Pasture where he'd been working through spring calving season and showed up in the kitchen doorway 2 hours before supper with his sleeves already rolled up. "Thought you might need a hand," he said. "I thought you might show up," she said. "There's an apron on the third hook." They cooked together the same way they'd cooked through the emergency in March. Divided territory, minimal discussion, no wasted motion. The kitchen was warm and loud with the sound of two people who understood each other's rhythm, and by the time the crew came to the table, the food was ready and right, and more than enough. Elias Ford ate 3 servings and said it was the best meal he'd had in 20 years, which was either true or very kind, and she decided it didn't matter which because both meant something. Danny Pruitt, sitting near the middle of the table in his usual seat, looked up when she came out with the dessert and said, to nobody specifically, she made a real cake. And she had. Not a flat emergency cake in a storm, not a rough approximation made from saved-up ingredients and limited time. A real cake, made with butter she'd been setting aside for a month and eggs. From the chickens she'd been properly managing since February. And good sugar and time. It was not a complicated cake. It was not the most beautiful cake anyone had ever seen. But it was done right, with all the care she had. And when she set it on the table, the room went briefly quiet in the specific way that a room goes quiet when something simple is exactly what it should be. Lily, sitting at the end of the table between Walt and Amos, looked at the cake and then at her mother with an expression that was so thoroughly her own, that specific combination of satisfaction and assessment, already calculating, already taking stock, that Marin had to look away for a moment. She looked like her father in that moment, just briefly, in the eyes. Marin set down the serving knife and breathed through it, and the moment passed, and she picked the knife back up. Some losses do not resolve. Some losses just become part of the structure of you, load-bearing in ways you don't always see. She had learned that. She carried James Whitmore the same way she carried everything. Not gone, just changed in form, present in the way her daughter's eyes were present, in the way she knew how to keep going in the specific manner she knew it, which she had largely learned from being his wife for 6 years before she had to learn to be herself without him. That was the truth she had never quite said out loud. Grief is not something you leave behind. You just get better at carrying it without letting it carry you. She cut the cake. She served it around the table. She sat down next to Gideon, who was not a man who would ever talk easily about the things sitting between them both, the absences that had made them into the people they were, but who reached under the table and put his hand briefly over hers when she sat down, which was enough, which was exactly enough. The summer that followed was the most functional Black Hollow Ranch had been in years. Gideon said so plainly in August, which for him was practically a speech. The spring calving had gone better than projected. The supply systems Marin had built held through the busy season without the shortfalls that had plagued previous years. The crew, now numbering 17 full-time with seasonal help in summer, operated with the specific efficiency of people who are well-fed and know it, which sounds trivial until you have worked somewhere that wasn't. Cole Mercer, in August, did something that surprised everyone, including himself. He came to Moran on a Tuesday afternoon with his hat in his hands, literally, which she had never seen from him before, and told her that his younger sister in Colorado had written to say her husband's operation was struggling and things were hard and he was worried about her. Marin listened. "I don't know why I'm telling you this," Cole said, which was not true. She could see exactly why he was telling her, even if he couldn't articulate it yet. He was telling her because she was the person on this ranch he had learned to trust with something beyond the practical, and that had taken him 6 months to figure out, and he was still slightly uncomfortable with it. "What does she need?" Marin said. "I don't know, more than I can send from here." "Can she cook?" Cole looked at her. "Her husband's the cook. She manages the house side." "Does she manage it well?" "From what she writes, she manages everything well. He's not—" Cole stopped. "He's a good man, but he's not practical about money." Marin thought about it. "Write to her," she said. "Tell her about the agency in Cheyenne. Tell her there are operations looking for good household managers, not just cooks. Tell her the work is there if she needs it." Cole looked at her with the expression he wore when something he'd expected to be complicated turned out to be straightforward. "That's it?" "Sometimes that's it," she said. "Someone just needs to know the door's there." He wrote the letter that evening. Marin knew because Danny told her, and Danny knew because Danny always knew, and she was beginning to understand that Danny Pruitt was going to be fine in this world. He had the specific combination of perceptiveness and loyalty that made people valuable everywhere they went, and someday he was going to figure that out about himself and do something with it. She told him so one morning in September when he was washing the breakfast dishes and she was starting the noon prep. He looked at her like she'd said something in a language he hadn't expected her to speak. "I'm just a ranch hand," he said. "You're 20 years old and you fixed a floor without being asked, and you've been running the morning coffee rotation without a mistake since March," she said. "You pay attention. That's not nothing. That's almost everything." He went quiet for a while. Then, "My mother used to say that paying attention matters. That most people don't, and the ones who do go far." He paused. "I thought she was just saying it because she was my mother." "She was right," Marin said. "Write to her more often." He did. She didn't ask how she knew. She just noticed his Tuesday letters got longer. By the time the first frost came in October, Black Hollow Ranch had a reputation in the county. It hadn't had the previous year. Not a loud reputation. Not the kind that gets talked up at the saloon in Clearwater, the quiet kind. The kind that spreads between ranchers and crew managers and employment agencies. The kind that means when you're looking for work, you put Black Hollow on your list, and when you're looking to hire, you call there first because their people don't leave. Gideon understood exactly why this had happened. He said so one evening in October, standing in the kitchen doorway while Marin was making the week's bread. He'd gotten better about doorways slightly. He still leaned, but the weight was more often forward than back. "You know what changed," he said. It wasn't a question. "The food," she said. "Not just the food." "I know," she said. She'd said it that way on purpose. "You know what I mean," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know what you mean." What she knew he meant was this. The thing that had changed at Black Hollow Ranch was not a supply system or a stove repair or a more efficient coffee rotation. Those were real, and they mattered. But the thing underneath all of them, the thing that made men stay and work hard and write longer letters to their mothers and learn to whistle with their fingers and sit down next to a 17-year-old from the trail and talk to him without being asked, was something less definable and more essential. It was the question of whether anyone on the property was thinking about them, whether the place they lived and worked held them in any kind of account. She had always believed that this was what feeding people was for, not calories, not sustenance in the bare technical sense, but the daily, repeated act of someone deciding that you were worth preparing for. Someone getting up before sunrise because you needed coffee before you went out into the cold. Someone knowing you had a bad tooth and making the biscuits softer. Someone stretching the supply list so it covered you, even when covering you required work they didn't have to do. That was what a kitchen was. That was what it had always been, in every difficult place she had ever worked. Not just food, evidence. Evidence that someone considered you. She had been building that evidence at Black Hollow Ranch since February, one meal at a time, and the ranch had become the kind of place it was because of it, and she did not say any of this to Gideon because he already knew it. He had known it since the stove seal, probably. He was not an unperceptive man. He had just needed someone to make it visible. In November, 1 year, almost to the week, after she'd stepped off the stagecoach with a patched bag and a 6-year-old and $40 and a letter, Lily got her horse. It was not a dramatic horse. It was a small bay mare, 7 years old, steady as anything, with a white mark on her nose that Lily decided immediately was shaped like a fish, and therefore the horse's name was Fish, which nobody on the ranch felt they had grounds to argue with. Walt had found the horse. Of course, Walt had found the horse. He'd been watching this horse trading in Clearwater for 2 months without telling anyone except Gideon, who had not told Marin, and the morning it arrived, Lily came out of the cookhouse after breakfast and found it standing at the south fence post in the exact spot where she and Walt had been having their daily conversations for 9 months. Lily stood very still for about 5 seconds. Then she turned around and looked at Walt, who was standing behind her with the expression of a man who had been waiting for this specific moment and had been looking forward to it for some time. "That's mine?" she said. "That's yours," Walt said. Lily looked back at the horse, at the white mark on the nose. She turned back to Walt with an expression Marin, watching from the kitchen window, recognized as her daughter working very hard not to cry because she had decided crying was something she didn't do in front of people. "Her name is Fish," Lily said very firmly. "Okay," Walt said. Because of the mark. I see it, Walt said, in the tone of a man who would have agreed with whatever name she chose. Lily walked to the fence. She put her hand out flat the way she'd learned, the way Walt had taught her, and Fish lowered her nose and touched it, and Lily's hand shook a little but stayed flat, and Marin turned away from the window. She stood at the stove with her back to the room for a moment, pressing both palms down on the warming rail, and she let herself feel it. All of it, the whole weight of the year, the cold February morning, and the bag in the snow, and the 30 seconds she'd given herself in a kitchen that smelled of neglect and stale flour, the letter burning in the firebox, Gideon's hands rough and warm, the flat cake in the storm, Elias Ford's voice saying, "We remembered you." She let herself feel all of it, and it was heavy. And it was also in the way of things that are fully yours, something like wealth. Then she dried her hands. She checked the bread. She started the noon prep, because the crew was coming in at 12, and they needed to eat, and they needed it to be good, and she was the one who made it good, and that was not a burden. That had never been a burden. Out at the south fence, she could hear Lily, thin and clear through the cold November air, attempting a signal whistle, the real kind through her fingers, the way Amos had been teaching her all fall. It took 3 tries. On the 4th, it landed, clean and bright and carrying further than you'd think a small sound could carry, out across the flat white ground and up toward the mountains that Walt had always said were watching, waiting to see what you'd do with the life you'd been handed. Marin listened until it faded. Then she turned up the heat and got back to work.